What if Batman Begins starred Cillian Murphy as the Cape Crusader? Not only that, what if there was no Tumbler, Gary Oldman played Scarecrow, and Harvey Dent was in the film instead of Rachel Dawes? Believe it or not, all of these things almost happened. So let's dive in and find out what happened behind the scenes to arrive at the movie we got, and also take a look at what could have been Batman Begins. Batman and Robin was such a disaster that it derailed the superhero genre for years. Studios grew weary, shelving other comic book projects out of fear they'd suffer the same fate. Still, Warner Brothers wasn't ready to abandon Batman entirely. It was too lucrative a brand. Over the next few years, Warner Brothers hired multiple filmmakers and writers to develop new takes on the character, including a gritty, ultra-violent version from Darren Aronofsky that reimagined Bruce Wayne as a street-level mechanic. However, all were turned down and never made it to camera. Eventually, Memento writer-director Christopher Nolan would throw his name into the mix too. At the time, he had just written a script about Howard Hughes, intended to star Jim Carrey, which he later described as the best script he'd ever written. But when he learned that The Aviator was already going into production, he shelved the project and began searching for something new. That search led him to Batman. His vision was a direct response to the campy excess of Batman and Robin. He not only wanted to do an origin story, which had yet to be done, but he also wanted to ground his Batman in the real world. Not being a comic book expert himself, Nolan reached out to Blade writer David Goyer to help develop the script. Despite loving Nolan's take and offering tons of ideas of his own for the movie, Goyer turned him down because he was worried it would never get made. Warner Brothers had already rejected several Batman scripts, and he didn't want to spend months working on another version that would end up on the shelf. Nolan, undeterred, took Goyer's ideas back to Warner Brothers. A few weeks later, he returned and told Goyer he had met with several people at the studio and that he and Goyer's take was the only one that really resonated with them, after they had rejected all of those other Batman ideas. He asked Goyer to reconsider, and when he agreed, it set the entire project in motion. The duo believed that if you could get the audience to care deeply about Bruce Wayne as a character without the cape and cowl, then they could successfully rehabilitate the franchise. That's why Batman doesn't appear in costume until nearly an hour into the film. The studio, however, pushed back against the idea. To appease them, the film originally opened with a brief shot from later in the movie of Batman descending through a cloud of bats at Arkham Asylum, before flashing back to Bruce's origin. But neither Goyer or Nolan liked this addition. As a result, they devised a new solution, an intense action sequence featuring Bruce Wayne early in the story. The result would be the escape from Ra's al Ghul's temple. The goal was to prove that a well-executed, emotionally grounded sequence could hold the audience's attention even without the batsuit, and deliver the spectacle early on that the studio wanted. They also pointed to Superman the movie, which similarly withheld its hero's full costume reveal until nearly halfway through the runtime. When it came time to choose the villains, Goyer encouraged Nolan to avoid anyone who had already appeared in previous Batman films. He wanted to signal to audiences that this would be a fresh take on the character, and suggested using Scarecrow and Ra's al Ghul. But their inclusion just wasn't about novelty. They were also thematically tied to the story Nolan wanted to tell. Batman Begins was fundamentally about fear. Bruce's fear of not living up to his father's legacy, and his journey to overcome that fear. This made Scarecrow and his fear toxin a natural fit. At the same time, Bruce's upbringing without a father created an opening for a mentor turned adversary like Ra's al Ghul to serve as a surrogate father figure. Initially though, Nolan envisioned Raz as a contemporary to Bruce, someone around the same age, and wanted Guy Pearce for the role, who he previously worked with on Memento. Goyer pushed back, arguing that their story worked better as a father-son dynamic, and that Raz needed to be older, so he suggested Liam Neeson for the part. Pearce would later recall being flown to London to discuss the role, only to realize on arrival that Nolan had already moved in a different direction. They flew me to London to discuss the Liam Neeson role, he said, and I think it was decided on my flight that I wasn't going to be in the movie. So I get there and Chris is like, hey, you want to see the Batmobile and get dinner? However, what may have influenced Nolan's decision was an executive at Warner Brothers, who quite openly said to Pearce's agent, I don't get Guy Pearce, I'm never going to get Guy Pearce, and I'm never going to employ Guy Pearce. Early drafts of the script included the Lazarus Pit, a supernatural element from the comics that restores Raz to life, but Nolan questioned whether Raz actually rose from it or if it was just ceremonial. Wanting to keep the film grounded in realism, he cut it entirely. However, the concept would return in The Dark Knight Rises, in the form of the underground prison, a metaphorical Lazarus pit from which Bruce rises and is reborn. Nolan initially approached Gary Oldman to play Scarecrow, but Oldman was growing tired of villain roles, so his manager suggested to Nolan that Oldman play Jim Gordon instead, an idea Nolan found intriguing. At the time, Oldman had recently gone through divorce and was raising his children as a single father in Los Angeles. With the film set to shoot in London, he was hesitant to take the part if it meant extended time away from his kids, so he asked Nolan if he could fly home on days he wasn't needed on set, and Nolan agreed. Over the course of production, Oldman made 27 round trips between LA and London, as he'd credit his jet lag for being responsible for Gordon's world weariness in his performance. Nolan, known for his skill in navigating studio dynamics, took a smart and diplomatic approach with Warner Brothers early in development. He asked them directly what would they be upset about if he didn't include. The studio's immediate response was the Batmobile. Nolan hadn't initially planned to include it, believing it felt too fantastical for the grounded, realistic tone he was aiming for, and that whoever directed the sequel could figure out how to include it. It's important to note that at this stage, Nolan saw Batman Begins as a one-off project. His goal was to reboot the character and then step away, passing the reins to another filmmaker for any sequels. After the meeting, Nolan began thinking about how the Batmobile could be reimagined in a way that fit his more grounded vision, as he'd immediately come up with the iconic "Does it come in black" line, which would be the first thing he'd write in the script. To bring the Batmobile to life, Nolan began by molding a rough prototype out of Play-Doh in his garage. He was soon joined by production designer Nathan Crowley, who transformed the space into a makeshift model shop. Using a technique called kit bashing, assembling parts from model kits, Crowley and Nolan refined the design into something that felt functional and grounded. Nolan and Goyer both felt that previous Batmobiles had prioritized style over practicality. They wanted something with real-world logic behind it. Collaborating with experts from DARPA, they developed the concept of the Batmobile as a military prototype, originally designed to tow cables across rivers and equipped with a rocket-powered jump system. When it came time to cast Bruce Wayne, Nolan initially met with Heath Ledger for the role, but Ledger wasn't interested, concerned that starring in a superhero film would limit his creative options, define his public image, and reduce him to an action figure. Goyer, however, pushed for Jake Gyllenhaal, Ledger's future Brokeback Mountain co-star, who eventually screen tested for the part. Cillian Murphy also tested, though both he and Nolan quickly agreed he wasn't the right fit to play Batman, largely due to his slimmer build. Still, Nolan saw an opportunity. At the time, Warner Brothers expected the film's villain, like previous Batman antagonists, to be portrayed by a major movie star. Nolan, however, had Murphy in mind for Scarecrow after Oldman passed on the part. To win over the studio, he arranged for Murphy to screen test as Batman, knowing that if executives saw his performance firsthand, they'd be more open to casting him in a different role. The gamble paid off. After the test, studio heads were impressed enough that when Nolan pitched Murphy as Scarecrow, there was no pushback. Christian Bale, fresh off The Machinist, also screen tested. What ultimately won him the role was his ability to create two distinct personas: a charismatic Bruce Wayne and a fearsome Batman who lowered the register of his voice into an intimidating growl. Nolan felt Bale struck the perfect balance of darkness and light the character demanded. The only issue was Bale's emaciated physique coming off The Machinist, leading Nolan to tell the actor to get as big as possible. Unfortunately, Bale took this a little too literally, and he arrived on set far larger than Nolan expected, earning the nickname Fat Man from the crew. So Nolan asked him to slim down slightly before shooting began. Helping actors with their screen tests was Amy Adams, who read opposite them as a favor to Nolan. While she was never in consideration for the role of Rachel Dawes, Nolan promised to keep her in mind for the future, a promise he later fulfilled when he cast her as Lois Lane in Man of Steel. Nolan and Goyer originally considered including Harvey Dent in Batman Begins, but ultimately decided to replace him with a new character, Rachel Dawes, feeling they couldn't do justice to Dent's arc within the scope of the first film. At the time, rumors circulated that Katie Holmes, who had recently risen to fame on Warner Brothers hit series Dawson's Creek, was strongly encouraged, if not outright pushed, onto the project by the studio. Warner Brothers was reportedly positioning her as their next major female movie star, which may explain why Amy Adams, who read opposite actors during their auditions, was never seriously considered for the role. Additional rumors suggested that both Nolan and Christian Bale were dissatisfied with Holmes' performance during the shoot. To capitalize on Holmes' popularity with young women, Warner Brothers even cut alternate trailers set to Nickelback that framed the film as a love story, as they targeted young female viewers. Ironically, although Rachel Dawes would be killed off in the sequel, possibly reflecting Nolan's lack of enthusiasm for Holmes, the actor would elect not to return, and was replaced by Maggie Gyllenhaal. Nolan and Goyer originally included a small moment in Batman Begins to acknowledge the black eye makeup Bruce wears beneath the cowl, something previous films had always ignored. In the scene, Alfred was meant to point out that Bruce still had some makeup smudged on his face before greeting guests at his birthday party. While the moment was ultimately cut, it would take until Matt Reeves' The Batman, a film often viewed as even more grounded than Nolan's take, for the eye makeup to finally be acknowledged on screen. The Joker card reveal at the end of the film also wasn't originally intended to launch a full-blown sequel. It was more of a fun tease, similar to the cliffhanger ending of Back to the Future. At the time, Nolan had committed to only a single film. However, during their first story meetings, he and Goyer had mapped out the broad strokes of where they could go, including the last scene in The Dark Knight Rises. When Batman Begins was released, it wasn't an immediate box office juggernaut. Audiences were still cautious after the fallout from Batman and Robin, and the film opened as a slow burn. But strong word of mouth and critical acclaim quickly turned the tide. As the film's reputation grew, so did its success, as Nolan felt a responsibility to deliver on the Joker tease and knew he had to direct the sequel himself to see the vision through properly, ultimately setting the stage for what what would become one of the most acclaimed trilogies in modern cinema. Thanks for watching, everybody, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more of Hollywood's untold stories and unmade movies.